Hi, folks. Welcome to another episode of the 7-Minute Takeover, where we talk all things acquisitions. I'm your host, Liz.
And I'm Eamonn.
And today we are chatting about tackling sellers' hesitations with holdbacks. So, Eamonn, let's dive in and chat about some of these objections.
Okay, yeah, happy to. Holdbacks, may not be the most contentious thing that you have to negotiate during an M&A process, but we've seen that they're negotiated on almost every deal. You submit an offer and the seller's going to come back with some objections, or if they're handled during due diligence, then you're certainly going to run into some roadblocks here. So we wanted to make sure that you have the tools to approach those conversations knowledgeably and get the seller on side.
And why does a buyer want to have a holdback in the first place? Why would it be a good idea?
So holdbacks technically are to protect and enforce that the seller honors their post-closing obligations. So most share purchase agreements will include some post-closing obligations, non-competes, and the important one is the lack of undisclosed liabilities. So if the company actually has a $20,000 payable out to a supplier that was not covered in due diligence or in the working capital calculation, then it gives the buyer recourse back to the seller to pay for that undisclosed liability.
I mean, you would hope that all of these items would be disclosed in due diligence, or as a buyer, you're going in eyes wide open, you're finding all of these, areas of concern, but obviously sometimes things are overlooked or not disclosed. So it's a great thing to have in place. And so why would a seller maybe not want a holdback in place?
The same thing that sellers always want. They want their money now, and they don't want to wait. And so, we can see in the deals that there are holdbacks. They can be, 3 to 6 months. And so that's the seller sitting around waiting, hoping that you don't lose the money in the meantime, or, that no big issue rears its head, but it leaves some risk on the table for sellers that either they're not going to get their full purchase price or that they're just not going to have the funds when they want them. And so they'll want to make sure that, the terms are set, that the situations in which you're claiming on a holdback seem reasonable to them. They don't want to pay that money out if they don't think that they owe it. So again, it involves trust. The other maybe more emotional side of it is that sellers may see you asking for too large of a holdback or too lengthy of a holdback as being an indication that you don't really trust them, you don't trust how they've run the business. They may see it as you accusing them of hiding something. And so that doesn't feel good, especially, if it pops up later in the discussion.
So what are some tips for getting the seller to agree to it then? And when are these conversations typically had? Are they negotiated pre-letter of intent or during due diligence, or when do these conversations typically come up?
It can be both. And so, we see holdbacks in the majority of share purchases. Sometimes an asset sale may not involve the holdback because, again, there's less risk of an undisclosed liability coming up. So if it's an asset sale, it would probably come up later in response to some specific concern that's been identified. But in a share purchase agreement process, it's recommended that you try and deal with it at the offer stage instead of the share purchase agreement stage. And the reason is that you don't know the business that well at the offer stage. It's more reasonable for you to ask for this type of protection. And then, if you wait till the share purchase agreement to negotiate it in, the seller again may feel like, hey, they've had a chance to look through all my information and, how I run my company, and now they're deeming that I'm too risky to be trusted and I need to have this holdback placed in. So again, it can maybe spur more of an emotional response if it's added later on. So we recommend adding it in the offer stage and kind of negotiating the high level terms then.
So, okay, so introducing it early on, letter of intent stage is kind of, introduced where, okay, this is like a standard part of the deal. And because we don't know everything right now, this is why we're adding this protection for ourselves, the buyer, versus adding it later when it's the definitive purchase agreement and you've had a chance to go through due diligence, whereas adding it then could breed some mistrust in the deal is what I'm kind of hearing from you.
Yeah, it's like maybe asking for a prenup a week before your wedding. You know, maybe it should have been addressed a little bit earlier.
That might not go over very well. Okay, got any stories of holdback situations that you've seen?
Yeah, sure. Got plenty. Like I said, you know, usually whatever offer is submitted may get negotiated. So we've seen buyers typically handle this pretty well just by explaining the value. And in certain cases, those holdbacks have paid off. I mean, we were aware of a situation that there was a holdback negotiated. This was for a small food service business. In a small town, notably. And so the seller actually owned the local newspaper as well. It was a flyer distributed once a week. And following the close of the sale, the seller came back to the buyer and said, hey, you owe me, 20 grand for these marketing services that my local newspaper has provided to your cafe. The contract with the related party had not been disclosed during the due diligence phase, which was key, right? If it was an undisclosed liability. And so the buyer turned around and said to the seller, great, we're happy to pay you the 20 grand, but we're going to net it off the holdback, or we can just forget this ever happened. And they didn't hear back from the seller on that topic again.
So very, very good example of where a holdback came in handy. Having it in place, I'm sure it probably would have been more of a contentious issue had there not been a holdback, and now the buyer's trying to scramble for this extra 20 grand, which is not a small bit of money either. So thanks for sharing that, Eamonn. And so what would be your key takeaways then for the audience here?
Well, there's a few key takeaways. One is that if you're executing a share purchase agreement, you should have a holdback of some kind. It can mitigate risks that you just don't see coming. You should try to get the commitment for a holdback at the offer stage, again, to mitigate the risk that you need to negotiate for it during the due diligence and share purchase agreement stage when there's a lot of other things to be negotiated. State the purpose of it clearly, like, it's not about distrust. It's standard in these types of transactions. You may want to make sure that the timing of it coincides with, any tax assessment or any key deadlines. So make sure you get a long enough holdback that it's meaningful and will allow any of these undisclosed liabilities to surface. And then use a third-party escrow. So use a lawyer to hold the funds in trust. Means you need to fund it up front, but it's going to build trust with the seller that there's not going to be any funny business. And I guess the last thing to leave you with is that the sellers that push back the hardest against holdbacks may be the ones that you need the most protection from, potentially. So, watch out for that kind of red flag as well.
Watch out for funny business, Eamonn says. Well, thanks for the insight on holdbacks, Eamonn. I know you see a lot of them in the deals that you're working on, so I appreciate your input. And that's a wrap for today, folks. So until next time, take care.
See you later.